Well, good morning, patrons. Thank you so much for supporting us as you do. We're out here in the car park, or one of the back areas of one of the car parks here at the Tank Museum. It's a lovely sultry day in early July. We've got Tankfest out the way. Great pleasure to meet some of you at the meet and greet, and I know some of you made the effort to come to Tankfest. I hope you enjoyed it, and do keep the questions coming. That's one of the things that we offer as to our patrons, or people who end up on Patreon or Patreon, is it you're supposed to say? I never quite know. So do put those questions. We've got some interesting ones today. As ever, I probably won't answer them all absolutely directly, but there's some with related stuff and some little bit of information I've dug out that perhaps is interesting, even if it doesn't quite answer the question asked. So let's get going. So the first one from Super Cacti. I've always had a great interest in the British Avery tanks. We all know the Churchill Avery with a 290mm spigot mortar, but when looking around the internet for more Avery tanks, I came across a rather interesting one, the Churchill Mark III Avery. Now, forgive my trying to pronounce this, Ardea Aggie. Now, we wondered when we said this, Ardea, two words, Ardea Aggie. The Ardea Aggie, when you actually say it quite quickly, is it our dear Aggie? Is that what you're supposed to say, as if it's my dear Aggie? But we're not too sure. But anyway, the Ardea Aggie. I was wondering if you guys have any information regarding this ridiculous tank, and if yes, can we maybe expect a video talking about it? I doubt if we'll ever do a video talking about it, but who knows, with the tank chats, we'll do some of the weird and wonderfuls and things that don't progress perhaps one day. But just so you know, yes, we do know a little bit about it. I had a quick look in the archive. It's illustrated in some of the books and on the Avery story. The gist was the petard mortar, when it's going into production, they're thinking, could we find a more powerful and more accurate and longer range gun in replace for the petard mortar that we're familiar with on the Avery. So in September of 1943, they go to ICI, the chemical company, and actually say, could you help us develop a new type of larger weapon? And they go for something that's about 10.5 inches diameter across the barrel, with about a 10-inch round that's going to go in there. And what's so odd about this one is how they're going to work it. Is they're going to get, a bit like the petard, a whopping great big round. We're talking 59 pounds here, size of the round that's going to be fired. They will put behind it a small charge to force it out the end of the barrel, but that charge, to lessen the amount of recoil, they're going to have a system in place where they actually have an equivalent weight. Basically, it's a dummy weight full of sand, which will be blast backwards out the rear of the turret at the same time. And that was the principle, the idea behind it. They do some tests on the 10.5-inch version. They don't think it works that well. They go and they have another go at a 9.5-inch version. But in the archive, we've got a list of the reasons they think it's not so good. And I'll just read some of them. Number one, the structure of the turret. By the very fact that you've got to put a hole in the rear of the turret to allow this secondary projectile to come out the back, that's almost like the counterweight projectile, there's a problem. So the structural integrity of the turret is lessened, and we'll talk about that again in a little bit later on when we talk about turret mantlets. So that was one thing they didn't like. Second thing was, when this rear part comes out, it wasn't, just don't think of it as a solid lump of sand. Think of it as, sometimes they did these things like what they call water charges. If they were testing a gun, they'd have a cardboard tube full of water or sand, and that would actually have the same resistance when they were firing going out the end. Now this thing, when it came out the back, ended up spreading sand all over the engine deck. And that, number one, if it did spread that sand out, is not a good thing, because of course sand all in your engine deck gets it's an abrasive, etc., and so it's not going to do your engine deck any good. The other point they were saying as well is, when you think of especially something like an Avery that might be assaulting a position, what's the chances of you having infantry behind you? Pretty large. So if something's flying out the rear that takes some of them out, it's not going to do them any favours, is it? With this sand bucket or projectile coming out the rear bit. So that wasn't liked. And the other problem they had is basically you're having to double the amount of stowage for that single round, because you've got the actual round that's going out as a projectile for the demolition charge and this equivalent round coming out the rear end. So these things are all listed there, which is why they don't progress with it. And so the Ardea Aggie doesn't really progress any further, and it's cancelled quite early on. One of the things that I just think is quite an interesting thing about it all is you're looking at some photographs and you think, oh, hang on, it seems to go further. But they actually, after the war, they put a 165 demolition gun onto the Avery as well, so they progressed in service. So the Avery does, in essence, get upgraded, and so they get a better gun, but that's not till post-war. So there we go, that's one answer I hope I've done for you, Super Cacti. Right, so calculus. Why didn't, and this kind of connects in a way, why didn't British tanks like the Churchill and Cromwell have traditional gun shields like on the Sherman, where it's on the outside compared to the Cromwell that it has on the inside of the turret? And is there any benefit of having the gun mantlet on the inside? Is it perhaps to stop water getting in, or to stop as a shot trap, or act as a kind of is a downside? It becomes a shot trap. Now I had a little look at this, and there's no obvious answers. I think this goes back to design styles and histories. But what I did find, so one of the things looking at is why many modern tanks don't have that traditional mantlet or shield on the outside of the turret with the gun in. Many of the modern tanks now, you look at Chieftain, it completely dispense with having any form of mantlet at all. The turret comes to a point and the gun is located in trunnions through that central opening at the front of the point. And some of the more modern vehicles as well, look at Leopard, look at Abrams, they've got it down to a very small squarish mantlet at the front of the turret. And some of the reasoning behind that is because with the counterbalancing and the idea of stabilisation on the gunnery, they want as little weight, they want to reduce the weight down that they're having to balance or counteract to keep that gun stable in action. And obviously the larger the idea of whether it's a casting or laminates or whatever as that mantlet gets, the more problem they're going to have in trying to stabilise what's already, with big 120mm guns or larger, it's already a really heavy weight they're having to deal with inside the turret. Now take that back, so one thing is weight, and that's an obvious thing when you're looking at when design process is going on, weight saving often becomes a factor. So often, in World War II, we're looking at, they're aiming for this weight, it creeps up if you add more armour and etc. So if you think about it, the idea of an internal shield can quite often mean that you're going to have less weight, because if you've got the barrel exiting the main part of the turret, the idea being that that outer shield quite often covers pieces that are already protected as part of its process. But again, that's adding a lot more weight than if it was on the inside, where you can reduce it to the area that's absolutely necessary. Now, one thing when we were looking at that, I couldn't find anything, or certainly in the time I've been looking at for this in the archive, that says specifically as if there's a particular philosophy behind why people are doing this at the time, other than the obvious weight saving. But what I did find was a really interesting little piece from the guy who was putting together the Churchill NA tanks with the 75mm guns on. Now, what happened in North Africa, one of the soldiers serving there in Remy he was in charge of all these tanks that were coming back that had been damaged. Could they be reused? Could we strip them for parts, etc.? Knew that the frontline soldiers, like the Sherman 75mm gun, because it can fire good high explosive and a good armour piercing round, the 6-pounder, good armour piercing, not much in the way of the high explosive. And so he looked at the idea, why don't we take the Sherman's 75mm gun and place it on the front of a Churchill on the turret and replace a 6-pounder gun there? And that idea he experimented with, and ended up that they made quite a number of these Churchill NA 75s, that they were called NA for North Africa, where he was doing this, and they go over and get shipped over to Italy. Now, that conversion, one of the points he also makes in the paperwork why they do that, and I'll read it to you because, again, it's another one of these things that you perhaps don't think about when you're looking about the advantages and disadvantages of an internal or an external shield, or mantlet as it's called. And he says this: in addition to being undergun, the gun mounting in the turret had an inside mantlet, and he's talking here about the Churchill. The gun and the coaxial bezer protruded through a large square hole in the front of the turret, the inside of the tank being protected by a slab of armour riding in slots and rising and falling as the gun was elevated and depressed. Although this arrangement afforded a degree of protection, it was anything but impervious to the machine gun splash, and being situated some 8 inches behind the front face of the turret, In the bright light and shadow of North Africa, it showed up as a distinct black patch on the front of the turret. This patch, for the German gunners, a convenient aiming mark, and is a fact that some 60% of Churchill casualties in the Majerba Valley battles were hit on or around the mantlet. The army commander, and indeed because many of the armoured formation preferred the more lightly armoured Sherman because of its 75mm gun with its range of 7,000 odd yards and an outside mantlet which casts no inconvenient shadow. So that's something that the troops are actually seeing and looking at, that again, and I'll come back to another question a little while later, where some of that experience in the field gets reflected back into design processes. And there's a first-hand user saying they don't like the internal mantlet for the reason that, number one, it still allows some bullet splash in, and number two, it's casting a large shadow on the front of the turret, which from their point of view is saying about as an aiming mark. So that's another part of that story. So in terms of the pros and cons, my main point would be lack of weight or less weight if it's on the inside. The outside, obviously, you're adding more weight, you're giving better protection and probably more cover for the idea of that external mantlet. But the pros and cons of doing this, I think, is bound to be down to the design office involved, some of their heritage, in other words, what are the vehicles they've worked on before, seen being used before. Obviously, things like machining costs, casting costs, what's going to take longer, all of these factors come into play. So I don't think there's an easy, straight answer there, but I hope that little bit from the archive helps pad out another part of the tank story. So, next question, Aaron Lee Earl. With the Desert Air Force making great strides being able to knock out tanks using cannons and rockets, it seems the Germans and Italians could never adapt to the threat other than making tracked motorised anti-aircraft weapons. Is it fair to say that from late 42 onwards, the Panzers had lost any momentum due to poor relations with the Luftwaffe? I would cut straight in there and say, no, I don't think it is fair to say that. I think you've got the situation that from late 42 onwards, it depends when you're going to look at these dates. From 43, it depends, like if you're looking at things like Dieppe, the fact that the air battle over Dieppe, the RAF was trying to take on the Luftwaffe. Actually, we lost more planes, but it's sort of like seen as one of those tipping points in time-wise, when actually from the spring of 44, when the real pressure goes onto the Luftwaffe, they've lost pilots all over the place. They're building planes. Planes is not their problem. It's actually trained pilots that happens in the later 2 years of the war for the Luftwaffe. So my issue there is, I think, number one is careful when we say about the Desert Air Force making great strides, being able to knock out tanks. We were getting better using cannons and rockets. Again, there's a lot of work's been done. There's some really good books and publications showing perhaps our general idea. There's a bit of a myth about how accurate some of this ground fire was, but it was effective in knocking out soft skins, not so effective in knocking out tanks. Big psychological impact on the enemy crews though, so that's big tick in the box for the RAF. Careful when we say about, as if they were pinpoint accurately knocking out tanks all over the place. That just doesn't happen in perhaps the way we've been led to believe, or I certainly was led to believe over the years. So that's the first thing I would say. So careful when we talk about that as a question. But this idea, the idea about Panzers losing momentum because they're kind of falling out with the Luftwaffe, or they haven't got poor relations, is the phrase you use. One of the things that doesn't happen in the German military compared to perhaps the RAF and the Army and the Navy, where there's definite rivalries, the Luftwaffe, when it is set up with a lot of army officers are transferred into this new arm for the German military, of course, when Hitler comes to power. Experiments behind the scenes, don't forget they've not been allowed an air force, and so when the Luftwaffe finally gets going, people such as, and great names that you'll know about, like Albert Kesselring, was an army officer, transfers to the Luftwaffe to get the Luftwaffe going. So this idea of somehow rivalries between the arms are certainly not as strong as they were, understandably, certainly in Britain and the RAF and the Army at things, and even that sometimes we can overplay them. But this idea that they're a completely separate wing, a lot of those guys serving, certainly the senior figures in the Luftwaffe, were people who had served in the German Wehrmacht or the army beforehand. So I don't see that as a problem. I see really the key issue here is the Luftwaffe is being dominated by the Allied air forces, certainly on the Western fronts, from say 1943 onwards. So certainly on the Eastern Front, the Panzers, the air battles are important, but there is less importance in terms of certainly on the Western Front, and obviously in terms of the bombing campaign. So I would say there, I can't say the Luftwaffe is poor relations with the army is causing the Panzers to struggle. I think it's just going back to attrition, losing planes, losing those pilots, and that whole German war machine grinding down over time with the scale of the battles they're fighting, mainly on the Eastern Front. Right, new person, Reverend Jane Carter. One of the things I'd just point out to patrons here as well, just out of interest, you're all welcome to ask questions. Obviously, we seem to get what I would call the nerdy end of the question marks here, sort of, or questions coming in. That doesn't stop anyone asking the most basic question, because, you know, you're a patron, you're supporting us. Ask whatever you like. And one of the questions I know that Jane's asking, I'll read her questions in a moment. Almost, you know, and again, what's your interest? Why are you coming? And Jane's interest is Dad served in Chieftains. Let's find out a bit more. So, you know, whatever way you're coming to support us, don't be afraid to ask those questions, or if there's an area of interest. It doesn't have to just be about the technology, it could be all sorts of other things. So let me read what Jane says. Hello folks, as a new patron, this is my first question, so please forgive me if this is old news to many of you. My father served with 3rd Royal Tank Regiment in the 70s and 80s, meaning that I grew up with the awesome sound of Chieftain as it rolled around the Senelaga ranges. I have since heard that this tank was notoriously unreliable and underpowered. Was this really fair criticism of a machine that I remember with such fondness, particularly because of the soul-moving noise it made when moving at speed? Knowing that many tanks are re-equipped when replaced by new tanks, what happened to the Chieftain once Challenger was introduced, and do you have any examples of them? Also, is there a reason as to why British main battle tanks are all named with the letter C? Thank you for what you do, preserving historical wonders like these. I spent many happy weekends in the museum as a child when my father was posted to Bovington prior to his leaving the army in the mid-1980s. Well, thank you, first of all, for saying what you're saying. So back to what are we talking about now? You made that comment, the soul-moving noise it made when moving at speed. Here at the Tank Museum, we have running Chieftains. And I always make the joke about there's a certain time of the year we tend to put the tanks to bed. They're worked on over the winter, but coming to Easter, spring's coming, the first of the vehicles are coming out. Chieftain, when it starts up, it's got a very distinguished whiny engine note that's really rather lovely. And I kid you not, I bet you every spring when that engine starts, there's blokes in the car parks, people getting out of cars, certain people in the organisation who work for us. You can almost hear them as if it's the first cuckoo of spring bit. Their heads pop up, you can see them looking around thinking, I recognise that sound, I've got to go in over and see that. And as they walk over to where the Chieftain is, sort of starting up, lots of nice big blue smoke coming out the rear end, and you can see them sniffing the air as if it's nectar, this lovely smell of the diesel fumes floating over and everything, and it takes them back. And that business about why we find some of these machines so evocative, is it the noise, is it the smell, is it what they look like in the distance, is it the ground shaking, all those sorts of bits and pieces coming together there. So you're not alone in having very fond memories of that noise. Reliability, I'm going to recommend something to you now. What I'd strongly say is go to the Works, which is the Remainder Bookshop, assuming if you're in Britain. Go to the Works, it's Remainder Bookshop chain, have a look in there, or if not, go on our website. We've done a manual, a Haynes manual on the Chieftain. And if you're interested, it's full of lovely photographs, them in exercises, all some of the places you mentioned, Senelaga, the wells in there. But it tells the story of the development of the Chieftain, what happened to it, what it was successful on, and of course, this business about reliability. And we're back to this thing called the Leyland L60 engine, which, again, Britain being Britain, we were trying to meet European or NATO ideas about a multi-fuel engine. So a lot of effort went into building this engine. It was supposed to either run on diesel, or it could be petrol, or it could be other sort of things. It never quite did what it was supposed to do. And a lot of the Chieftain's story is how those engines, as they're going through the time it's in service, are going either taken out and having improvement programs on the engines, rebuilds, new liners, all sorts of things, trying to get the engine more reliable. And really interestingly, the irony is here at the Tank Museum, We don't have any problems with our Chieftain in terms of its engine. We've got some other problems with it, but actually the engine in our Chieftain has been very reliable. So is that part of how it's being used, how it's being looked after and everything else over time as well. So what happens to them when they come out of service? Chieftains were still at the time it was being replaced. Challenger 1 takes over from Chieftain. We used to have things called war reserves, so sometimes tanks were put into storage. Chieftain pretty much went at the time, and there's something called CFE Europe, Conventional Forces Europe. It was a treaty that says how many tanks we declare and we're allowed to have, and the Russians would come and count the NATO tanks, we would go and count the Russian tanks. So one of the things is some tanks were sold on, so you can go to certain places, like there's one or two of these tank driving experience places where you can have a go in a Chieftain. Some of them went for range targets, so they were out there on the ranges to be fired at, and some of them were destroyed because to meet the Conventional Forces Europe Treaty, they ended up blowing some of them up or cutting the barrels and everything. It had to be done in a way that this piece of equipment was seen that it couldn't be reused, and we ended up with a number of them. There is a point when, because scrap was not worth much money at the time, in other words, second-hand steel and iron, there was a point you could buy a Chieftain tank for £800. And now, of course, they've crept back up in prices, not only just because people like collecting things like that. It's a big, amazing looking object, obviously having a whole tank there. One of the other things they're interested nowadays, of course, is because of that L60 engine, actually you can buy the whole tank for not a vast amount, but if it's a tank with an engine in that works, then they're now going for about £30,000 plus sort of thing. But still a relatively small amount if you consider how much they cost in their service life. And Letters C starts back in World War II. Churchill, we were calling tanks, they'd got all these complex A numbers and various other things, cruiser tanks, infantry tanks. Churchill says, no, give them a name. And he's the one who insisted, first of all, the American tanks that were coming into Britain, give them a name of a American Civil War general, so hence Sherman, hence Stuart, etc. And for Britain, we really start the C process. It's one of these things that's not an absolute stamped order on a certain date. It develops that we end up giving that idea. So we've got Challenger, we've got Comet, we've got Cromwell, etc. in the Second World War, but it doesn't always, think we had Valentine, etc. So it doesn't always follow on that sense. But really, from about the early days of World War II, we are looking at C's is there, and we're now going full circle in a way, because don't forget we had Challenger A30 in World War II. We've got Challenger 1 and then Challenger 2 and perhaps an upgrade on Challenger 2, whether they call it Challenger 3 or something, we're still not sure yet. So welcome to the club. Thank you for supporting us. Keep the questions coming. And as I said before, don't worry about asking questions that, because we've got a range of different viewers and levels of interest. Doesn't have to be high level nerdy specific details. Don't be afraid to ask the obvious as well, but do have a look at that Haynes manual, Chieftain tank by Dick Taylor, done in cooperation with us. Have a look at that and you'll love all the imagery, and it's not a lot of money, and I've seen them being remaindered for about £5-6 in the works, so have a look at that one. Right, Robert Henry Ilston. Was there ever any consideration by any of the main Allied nations to create self-propelled tank destroyers similar to the Stugs of Germany that were turretless with the main gun in the hull? Yes, and one was produced, if you think about it, the Archer, which is a Valentine with the gun facing over the rear engine deck. Other examples that were done, the Lecto is a small little vehicle that they were deciding on. There's a number of experimental projects. They even did some wheeled stuff where they were going to put a 6-pounder gun in the front, facing forward with minimal sort of traverse, a bit like a Sturmgeschütz type of thing. We don't go into that in the same way because we like the idea of the turreted and the way that can work. But I'll come on to Archer in a moment. I think one of the key elements about this is that idea of cost, simplicity and manufacture. The key thing about the Sturmgeschütz, and I always, a figure I've said so many times before, 3 of those can be built for the cost of 2 Panzer IIIs. So again, when you're looking at what you can produce, and again we go back to the Sturmgeschütz for the Germans. Yes, they're building the idea before the Second World War, but as soon as they're on the defensive, a low silhouette vehicle in the defence that can manoeuvre to a certain degree issued to the artillery unit is tremendously useful. And there was arguments in the 30s because the Guderian wanted them as part of the tank corps, the Panzer arm. Actually, they were saying, no, we want these as almost like infantry support vehicles given to the artillery. So there was debates going on there, but the Sturmgeschütz becomes a really useful vehicle for the Germans. So I think it's mainly they're pushing that as well because of its utility and simplicity. Don't forget the Western allies have slightly different agendas on that. The Russians, of course, do build with the Su-100, etc., and Su-85. They do follow that same sort of idea behind putting a main gun without a turret. But we'll come on also talking about the Archer again in another question in a moment. Where we got to. So, Vincent van der Veen. Did countries like the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway have any plans to build tanks before the Second World War? And if they were ever built, would those nations have stood a better chance against the Germans or Japanese during the war? Now, you've mentioned here Netherlands. They just start importing some tanks. Dutch East Indies, they are buying some British export Vickers 6-ton export tanks, a version that in Britain we called the Dutchman, understandably. They're just starting to be sent out to the Far East. When war is declared, we impound the rest of them and use them for training in Britain. Denmark's, but they've not got their homegrown industry. You're starting to get some armoured cars in the 20s and 30s. Holland is experimenting, and a little bit like Norway. Norway imports a tank from Sweden, but it's much more about learning how to defend against tanks than actually start building them in their own country. So again, the countries you happen to mention, Netherlands, Denmark, same thing, a few armoured cars in the late 30s, no tanks, and they're not looking. A number of countries don't forget, we're still looking 20s and 30s, age of experimentation, manufacturing. Really the two big makers are Vickers in the UK. France has been exporting tanks, and then only from 33 onward, openly did Germany actually start saying, look at this in terms of issues of tanks. The big boys with tanks are Russia. So industrially, most of the countries that you're mentioning haven't got either the industries or the desire for tanks yet. Their militaries are thinking we ought to be looking at this sort of material. The one country you don't mention, looking at that Scandinavian, is Sweden, who do set up a tank industry, and they get Hans Vollmer, the German who's making the A7V tank in the First World War, after the war to continue practicing, in essence, his art, his experience. He goes at one point to Sweden. And the Swedes, if you look at things like the tanks they're developing in the 20s and 30s, including, we've got an example here in the collection, an M40 tank, they look from a distance almost 1930s Germanic, and I think that's that Hans Vollmer engagement that he's got there. And Sweden do build tanks, and again they get actually a big tank industry going, but they're not actually involved in the Second World War. And the second part of your question is, would they have stood a better chance against the Germans or the Japanese in the war? I don't think so. I still think by, again, look at the Netherlands, the size of the country, even if they had a big tank fleet, yes, they'd have done better, but probably not that good. Denmark, forget it. It's such a small country in terms of trying to stand up to the Germans, 2 hours of fighting before surrender. And Norway as well, the same thing. Yes, there's a very brave fights go on, but I don't think tanks is going to make a huge amount of difference. And there's another issue, of course, with Norway in particular. It's the terrain. Where do you use these tanks when you've got such either mountainous and fjords and everything else? That's going to be the problem there. And I've got here, last question, you'll be so pleased to know. Interceptor 57, good to meet you at Tankfest. Well done for coming all the way over from California. Hello, David. Can you describe how differently the British treated the tank destroyer vehicles compared to the Americans? Americans followed the tank destroyer doctrine to respond to enemy breakthroughs. Is the British different from this, and if so, how? It is often been described that the self-propelled guns and tank destroyers in British service were more akin to self-propelled artillery rather than tank destroyers, in that rather than viewing the piece as a moving gun that can hunt and respond to the enemy tanks, it's more of a gun that can move away from compromised positions. Do you think this is accurate? I think the problem of answering this question is it changes in the war. And what I've done is I've actually found a really interesting report. I'm just going to read you a couple little bits about a guy from the Department of Tank Design. Sorry, there's a vehicle driving past. Department of Tank Design is sent out to Italy in late 44, and his report comes back, And one of the things he looks at is how the tank destroyers are being used by the British, and he actually does a couple of comparisons to the Americans, and that's really interesting. So if you're unfamiliar, the idea is the American tank doctrine was really saying that your Shermans are like a little bit like in Britain we would call them cruiser tanks. Once a breakthrough's made, they go off, they exploit the gap. If they do meet the enemy, and they were designed that, you know, it wasn't they were to avoid tank on tank engagements, but the likelihood of that was going to be fairly small. If the enemy are coming the other way with tanks, you have towed anti-tank guns, but you also put a anti-tank gun on a tracked chassis, normally again sensible Americans, some sort of chassis that's already in service, so the parts are the same, and the idea is they will be mobile enough to speed to where a breakthrough's occurred and to therefore set up an anti-tank defence quickly. Now, as we know, when the actual D-Day onwards, even in North Africa, this policy breaks down because you never have quite the right vehicles in the right place. There is a tendency, and it's certainly prevalent in the British forces to a degree, in the Americans, they don't use them in the way that they was intended. Now the worry, and it comes across in this report I'll quote from in a moment, was that you look at vehicles like the M10, and again in British service we had the 17-pounder gun, call it the Achilles, you see those commanders are looking at them and almost thinking to use them like tanks when their armour protection levels are nowhere near a tank and they have other vulnerabilities. So an open top, air burst, again in the report, they're looking at, yes, they like the visibility, they like the workspace being open top, but could we have an armoured roof? And Britain made a tank after the war called Avenger with that type of armoured roof on the top because of this worry about air burst. So they're not as well protected as a tank. And the danger was vehicles like the M10 end up being subtly pushed and used as if they are tanks when they aren't. Now, if you look again at the British reports, the difference between the two, the British start and they develop as the war goes on, but different periods and different times and different units find. So, for example, there's a Churchill unit that are integrating the M10s with a 17-pounder gun on into a section of Churchill. So there's normally an M10 almost going ahead with each section of Churchill tanks, acting in what nowadays we might call the overwatch role, but because they've got the 17-pounder on, the Churchills feel almost they're being protected by this tank destroyer that's coming with them should they get into any difficulties when they've only got their 6-pounder guns on or 75mm guns on. So you can see how, again, unit commanders, and if you look at the way this, we are not doctrinally nailed down in World War II in a manner that you can only do this with this bit of equipment. That learning process is going on all the time, and it reflects in part of this report that we've got in the archive of what's coming back. And there's a cracking series of comments that are talking all about, and it looks like I'm missing one of my pages. Where did that go? But it talks about those different things that the troops are suggesting, and one of the points it's making is the danger that the M10s are being used as substitute tanks. That's in the report, because they look like tanks. The Archers, which is, again, it's a Valentine tank chassis, 17-pounder gun, put in a shield, the gun faces over the rear engine decks, the tank drives into a position, reverses into it, and so they like that because, number one, the gun facing rear psychologically makes it not look like the tank, so people just aren't making that simple mistake. But number two, they're also saying because of its lower profile compared to the M10 and the effectiveness, again, of that 17-pounder, they really think that is a very, very important differentiation and why the troops are liking the Archer, and there's a list of the different things they think that are very good about it. And one of the things that comes across is the guy's gone and talked to different units and found the way they're using them is different in where they're appearing on the battlefield, how they're being brought forward, where they're being placed in, again, as I mentioned, this idea of covering in advance, so that overwatch position, the fact that, again, if they're being defended, and the fact, again, he mentions here, like a lot of them, and you mentioned in your question, a lot of them then, because they are issued to artillery anti-tank units, the artillery call on them to help back up artillery strikes against the enemy. So again, you've got that situation where actually you think it's a 17-pounder anti-tank gun, actually come over and join in our stonk or bombardment, as it would be called, against an enemy position. So they're being used for that as well because of their artillery trained background, which again is quite interesting. But the idea, if they're sucked into some of the armoured units, that idea that there's a danger that you can be used as a tank. The Archer, because it doesn't look like a tank, is really successful in that way because they're not pushing it into positions that it shouldn't be in. So I hope, in a sort of sense, that doesn't completely answer it, but one of the things there, I'll try and dig other things out of the archive, because it's just amazing where you go in the archives and the fact you're getting these contemporary reports, quotes from the field, guys explaining things. There's a brilliant one here saying, as part of that same report, saying the British cooker that they're being issued, complete waste of time. All the guys do is exactly what they did in North Africa. Here he calls them a Tobruk cooker. They just get a half-empty tin box, empty old petrol or biscuit tin, fill it full of sand or earth, pour some petrol on. They're using that as a cooker, so don't bother. Simple little details like on the Archer, the rangefinder box collects water and damages, so don't bother with that. And we, by the way, no one ever is using the rangefinder anyway, so are you sure that's really necessary? One shovel issued with an Archer. They always want 2 shovels, they always carry 1 spare, so why not give them a position for a second shovel? Lots of lovely little details being fed back to Department of Tank Design, so that can hopefully influence the equipment as it's being developed for the troops. So I've gone on, God knows how long. Apologies for we've talked all that amount of time. Hope it's answered some of your questions. Do keep those questions coming in the future, and I won't always bore you this length. I can give you a yes or no answer as well if necessary, but we hope, as part of you supporting us, you enjoy this. If you don't be afraid to tell us. But thank you as ever for supporting us, allowing us to do this. And well done to Alex, who's standing behind the camera here for the first time. He's actually doing some filming, so this is all wobbly, blame him. And the fact it's gone on so long is because he hasn't stood there and had the guts to say, will you shut up and cut it? But there we are. So see you next time.